I once had to prepare for 2 job interviews in North Carolina while still living in New York. To save money, I decided to drive down instead of flying. My current job at the time wasn't great, and the 2 jobs I was interviewing for could potentially be a fresh start. They were both corporate office positions with good pay and benefits, and on top of that, the weather down there was far better than in New York. I set out on a Thursday night after taking the day off from work on Friday for the interviews. As soon as I got off work, I rushed home to grab my suitcase and other essentials, said goodbye to my family, and hit the road. The drive was over 8 hours long, and I was expected to arrive at around 2 a.m. I had booked a room at a Comfort Inn. During the first few hours of driving, I had downed 3 cups of coffee and felt relatively alert. However, once you're running on fumes, no amount of coffee will keep you going forever. I hadn't slept much the night before, stressing over the interviews, and after a long day at work, the last thing I wanted was to be driving for almost 9 hours. By now, it was late at night, and I still had about 2 hours left in the drive. The roads were practically deserted, with only the occasional car passing by. I was starting to feel more and more fatigued, but I knew I was getting close. Suddenly, I saw a man in a suit standing on the side of the highway, completely still. He wasn't moving, just facing my car. As I drove past, I noticed his head turning to follow my car. I muttered out loud, "What the hell?" It was the weirdest thing. I almost considered turning around to see if he needed help, but he was just standing there in the middle of the highway, dressed in a suit, in the dead of night. I started making up stories in my head about what could have happened to him. Maybe his girlfriend kicked him out of the car or something. I did this to keep myself awake as I felt like I was drifting. Then something even more unsettling happened. Not even 10 minutes later, I saw another man on the side of the road, also in a suit, also just standing there. What the hell was going on? I slowed down, thinking maybe I should pull over and see if he was all right, or maybe offer him a ride. But right as I was almost at a full stop, I looked in my rearview mirror, turned around, and he was gone, as if he just vanished. I floored it and sped back onto the road. I felt like I was losing my mind. At this point, I needed another coffee. I had about an hour and a half left to go. I stopped at the next rest area I could find and bought a medium coffee. I took a few sips while sitting in the parking lot, and then I saw him again, a man in a suit, standing under a light post. It was the same guy. This time, I got a clearer look at his face. A middle-aged white man, short brown hair, clean-shaven, with a neutral expression. But the fact that he was, once again, facing my car made my skin crawl. I turned the car on and drove out of there without a second glance. I wanted to finish this drive, but the coffee wasn't doing its job. I felt like I was going to pass out at the wheel, so I pulled into some random parking lot and reclined my seat, trying to get some sleep. As exhausted as I was, I couldn't shake the fear of being in this empty lot. Scared that if I opened my eyes, I'd see that man again. I was drifting in and out of sleep when something startled me awake. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I looked around the car, paranoid that I'd spot him. I checked all the windows, the windshield, nothing. But then I looked in the rearview mirror, and my heart dropped. There was a man sitting in the back seat. The same man in the suit. I didn't look long enough to be sure because I immediately threw the door open, screamed, and fell out of the car. Crawling backward, I kept screaming until I got the courage to look inside the car. No one was there. The back seat was empty. As I calmed down, I realized my mind had been playing tricks on me all night. There was no man in a suit. I was just completely exhausted and needed to sleep. My heart was still racing, but by now I was too awake to go back to sleep. So I turned the car on, finished the coffee, and powered through the last leg of the drive. By the time I got to the hotel and into my room, I collapsed into bed and passed out immediately. The next morning, my first interview was at 11 a.m. I hadn't slept much, but I felt somewhat recharged. However, the second my interviewer walked out to greet me, I froze. He looked exactly like the man in the suit I had been seeing all night. I could tell he noticed my reaction, and I saw the confusion on his face. I tried to recover, but it threw off my entire interview. I was completely rattled and couldn't focus. The interview ended up being a mess, and I had only an hour to get ready for the next one. My second interviewer was a woman, and I did much better this time. I ended up getting the job, and I'm still living and working in North Carolina today. Later, my therapist told me she believed the stress of preparing for the interviews, combined with the lack of sleep, had caused me to hallucinate. The man in the suit was a manifestation of my anxiety about the interviews. It doesn't sound too far-fetched, but it doesn't make the experience any less terrifying. I was driving through Clearfield County, Pennsylvania one night, trying to avoid traffic on my way home. It was just past midnight, and the road was almost completely deserted, the way I liked it. I was listening to my usual podcast on the radio when a chime went off in my car, alerting me that I was running low on fuel. I quickly opened the map app to find the nearest gas station, which was on a quiet, isolated road ahead. About 5 minutes later, I pulled into a gas station on the right. It was the only parking lot for miles, since the road was mostly surrounded by woods on both sides. This was a pretty nondescript, no-name gas station. I parked by the pump and noticed a man filling up his old, beat-up pickup truck. As I walked past him and into the store, he stared at me. Inside, I bought a cup of coffee and paid cash for the gas. When I got back to my car, I saw that the man had gotten into his truck and driven off. After a few minutes of refueling, I got back in my car and continued driving. But not even a minute after leaving the station, I noticed the same pickup truck from earlier parked on the side of the road next to the woods, with its lights off. Odd. I kept driving, occasionally glancing in my rearview mirror to see if it would start moving again. Nothing. I turned my podcast back on and continued the drive. A few minutes later, another chime went off in my car. The dashboard showed that one of my tires was low. I slowed down and started hearing a wobbling noise. I rolled down the window and instantly realized I had a flat tire. I pulled over and got out to check. It was the rear driver's side tire, and it was completely flat. I didn't recall hitting anything. If I had, I would have felt it. The thought crossed my mind. Could the guy from the gas station have slashed it? I pulled out my phone and began searching for the number for roadside assistance. Meanwhile, I heard the sound of a car or truck coming down the road behind me, but weirdly, there were no headlights. Everything was pitch black. Then the engine noise suddenly stopped, and everything went quiet again. I walked to the back of my car and grabbed the SOS flashlight from the toolbox my dad had given me as a Christmas present. I turned it on and aimed it down the road. In the distance, about 200 feet away, I could see the reflection of a truck's headlights. It was that same pickup truck again. Panic set in, and I bolted into the woods, ducking behind a big bush and tree. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. As I crouched there, I heard the truck engine start again, and this time the headlights were on. I could hear and see the truck pull up next to my car through the gaps in the bushes. After a moment of silence, a man shouted, "Do you need some help?" I knew better than to answer. 911 picked up, and I whispered my location, explaining that someone had slashed my tire, and I thought they were following me. The operator asked a series of standard questions, wanting me to describe the man and his truck. I heard the truck door open and close. I told her the man had gotten out of his truck. She advised me to stay hidden in the woods if I believed he was a threat. She asked if I could see if he had any weapons, but then the call cut off. The cell reception was terrible in this area. I hoped she would call me back, but no luck. I heard another car pass by on the road. It slowed down, and then I heard voices. It was another man talking. I crept closer to the edge of the woods to get a better view of the road. I saw the man from the pickup truck standing next to another stopped truck in the middle of the road, talking to the driver. I overheard the creepy guy spinning some made-up story about what was happening. At that moment, I ran out into the road and yelled, "Help! I don't know him." Both the man in the truck and the one who had been following me turned to look at me. I quickly told the man in the truck that this guy had slashed my tire and followed me here. The man in the truck looked shocked and glanced at the creepy guy with suspicion. The man denied everything, claiming he didn't know me and had never seen me before. At the same time, he quickly retreated to his pickup, backed up, and sped off down the road. The man in the second truck got out and checked my tire, then offered to give me a ride into town. I told him the police were already on their way, and sure enough, a few minutes later, a police car pulled up with its lights flashing. The man vouched for me when I explained to the officer what had happened. The officer said he'd go back to the gas station to check the security camera footage to see if it captured the pickup driver slashing my tire. The officer took down my information and stayed with me while I waited for roadside assistance. The tow truck driver gave me a ride to a repair shop where my dad later came to pick me up. I never heard back from the officer, so I guess they didn't find anything in the footage. It's terrifying to think how close I came to possibly being abducted. It was the most terrifying and haunting night of my life. Even now, thinking about it still sends chills down my spine. I'm 28 years old, and my boyfriend Todd lives in a different state. We usually take turns visiting each other, but I often end up going to see him more because he has his own place, while I still live with my sister. I had planned to visit Todd for a week during winter break since I'm a teacher and had time off, so I packed quite a bit. I was driving my old 2009 Hyundai Sonata, a car I had bought from my sister. Up where Todd lives, the snow had already covered the ground, so the further north I drove, the more careful I had to be because my car wasn't really built for snow. It was already pretty late, and the snow had started coming down hard. Even though there had been blizzard warnings earlier, both Todd and I figured it would be better to try and make it through the storm that night rather than wait until the next morning when the roads would likely be even worse. However, I eventually realized that I would need to find somewhere to stay overnight, as the road conditions were getting dangerous, and I still had quite a distance to go. After stopping at a small diner for a quick sandwich and coffee, the waitress I'd been chatting with advised me not to keep driving. She suggested a few hotels and motels nearby. After she left and I was finishing up my meal, a guy sitting at the bar turned around and said, "There's a motel just up the road." I looked up the motel on my phone and saw that it was only about 5 minutes away. He added that it was nice and cheap, so I could just crash for the night and hit the road again in the morning. It seemed like he had overheard my entire conversation with the waitress. He was just sitting there at the bar with the beer. I was surprised since I'd never seen anyone come to a diner just to drink, and I didn't even know diners served alcohol. But I guess people around where Todd lives are a bit different from what I'm used to, having grown up in the city. The man introduced himself as Toby, and I gave him a fake name, saying I was Michelle. For the rest of the time I was there, Toby kept half-facing me in his spinning bar stool, watching. I wasn't interested in keeping the conversation going, so I stared out the window at the falling snow until the waitress brought me my check. After paying, I said goodbye to them both and left. In the half hour I had spent in the diner, the snow had piled up by at least an inch. I needed to get to that motel as soon as possible. I drove slowly and arrived at the motel within about 10 minutes. There were a few cars parked outside. The motel looked cheap, but that's exactly what I needed. I didn't want to spend too much. I went to the front desk and asked for a room for the night. I think I paid around $50, and the man at the desk handed me the key to one of the ground floor rooms. I walked back outside to grab my things from the car and brought them into the room. It was a tiny space with tacky wallpaper, a queen-sized bed, and red carpeting. But it would do for the night. I tried to FaceTime Todd, but there was no cell reception. The motel had Wi-Fi, but I figured the password was at the front desk. So I put my shoes back on and hurried out into the cold to get the Wi-Fi password. On my way there, I noticed a new car in the parking lot. I saw someone sitting inside it, but I didn't really pay much attention, because who does? The man at the front desk pointed lazily to the sign with the Wi-Fi password, and I typed it in. It took a minute, but I was finally connected. I hurried back to my room, locked the door, and tried FaceTiming Todd again. Even with Wi-Fi, the connection was terrible. I could see him, but the video kept freezing for a few seconds at a time, and his voice kept cutting out. At least, I managed to let him know I was safe at the motel. We eventually decided to just text, since FaceTime wasn't working. We were texting for a few minutes when I heard something coming from the bathroom. I leaned forward and saw that the bathroom door was shut. Had it been closed before? I couldn't remember. I texted Todd that I'd heard something and started freaking out when I realized I had run to the front desk without locking the door to my room. Todd asked if the door locked automatically. I said I didn't think so, but now I couldn't remember if I had left it slightly open or not. He told me to get up and check the door, and to bring the key with me. I put my shoes on and went to the door, which had a traditional twist lock that could be locked from the inside or with a key from the outside. I opened the door to check, but I immediately noticed an extra set of footprints leading to my door. Footprints that came from that car I had seen someone sitting in. And now, no one was sitting in the car anymore. My heart started racing, but instead of screaming, I calmly shut the door and ran back to the front desk. I cried to the man behind the desk, telling him there was someone in my room. The front desk clerk wasn't some big, intimidating guy, so I don't think he wanted to deal with it. He told me to wait with him while he called someone. I thought he was calling the police, but instead, he started speaking in another language. I assumed he was calling a friend or colleague. He hung up and told me again to stay with him. I was standing in a spot where I could see through the glass window down toward my room. I let out a scream when I saw the door to my room open and Toby, the man from the diner, walking to his car. We locked eyes for a second before he got into his car, backed out, and slowly disappeared down the snowy road. The front desk worker's friend, or whoever it was, arrived a little while later. He was a big guy who didn't speak English. I don't know what they were saying to each other, but the front desk guy offered me a different room, free of charge, to help me feel safer. I didn't feel any safer, but I didn't have much choice at that point. I took the new key, and the two men helped me move my things to the new room. Todd offered to come and get me, but I told him not to. It would take too long, and the roads were dangerous with all the snow. The next morning, the streets had been plowed enough for me to finish my drive to Todd's. Looking back, I don't like how the motel clerk probably didn't call the police because he didn't want the motel to get into trouble. I called the diner to warn them about the man. After that, I lost my trust in strangers. Not after this. Before we dive into the next story, if you're here for the first time, let me know where you're tuning in from. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of the upcoming scary stories. We appreciate your support. Feel free to share these stories with your friends and family. Thank you. I was driving home from work one night, following the same route I always take. I had just gotten off work around midnight, so it was probably about 12:15 a.m. by then. The town I live in is pretty quiet and uneventful, surrounded by lots of woods with only a few scattered houses here and there. I was driving on a road not far from my house, with a cornfield on one side and a small patch of woods on the other. It was midsummer, around 75 degrees Fahrenheit, so I had the top down on my convertible. I was going about 50 miles per hour when suddenly, I heard a high-pitched, blood-curdling scream from a woman somewhere by the side of the road, but I couldn't tell which direction it came from. I quickly slammed on the brakes and brought the car to a stop, listening more closely. There it was, a woman's voice, crying for help, coming from the left side, somewhere in the woods. She was shouting for help. I got out of the car, grabbed the baton I keep in the back seat, and made my way toward the woods. I called out, "Who's out there?" And the woman immediately called back, "Please, help me." I started running into the woods, pushing away branches and bushes as I went. I yelled for her to keep screaming so I could find her. Every 10 seconds or so, she'd shout, "Help," and I'd head in that direction, yelling back. But after a short while, I realized something strange. No matter how far I ran into the woods, her cries weren't getting any closer or louder. In fact, they seemed to stay the same distance away, even though I was running straight toward the sound. I yelled, "Tell me where you are," and about 5 seconds later, she screamed, "Help," again. I froze in my tracks. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, it felt like I was walking into some kind of trap. Without hesitation, I turned around and ran back the way I had come. I kept running until I could finally see the flashing headlights of my car on the side of the road through the trees. Even on my way back, I could still hear her screams. But the distance between us hadn't changed, almost as if she was following me back. Was I being stalked? I jumped into my car and sped off, completely freaked out. I called 911 to report the incident to the authorities, just in case they wanted to investigate. But I wasn't sticking around. I was too shaken up to think about it any longer. After telling a few friends and family about the strange encounter, I decided to move on and get back to my normal routine. However, about a week later, I saw something on the news that made my stomach turn. The body of a woman in her 30s had been found in the woods by a man walking his dog. Strangely, there were no signs of foul play. The location where the body was found matched the same general area where I had heard the screams. Even though that patch of woods is quite large, I can't help but think this was an eerie and terrifying coincidence. I was driving from Brooklyn to Vermont to my friend John's cabin for a weekend of snowboarding. At the time, I owned two cars, a 2013 BMW 3 Series and a 2006 Ford F-150. And on this particular night, I was driving the Ford F-150. All my snowboarding gear was in the truck bed. At that point, I was about 45 minutes away from John's cabin. It was late, around 1 a.m. The road was pitch black, snow was falling heavily, and there wasn't another car in sight. I had just gotten my truck back from the mechanic a few weeks prior. The truck often had problems, and that night was no exception, perhaps the worst timing. On this quiet, dark road, the engine suddenly began overheating, with the temperature gauge shooting into the red zone. I slowed down, pulled over, and waited for the engine to cool. I tried to drive again, but even at a slow speed, the needle went back up to the red and the engine overheated once more. I had to pull over and turn the truck off. I got out, popped the hood, and tried to figure out the issue, but in the dark and snow, I couldn't see anything. I thought about calling John, but on this stretch of road, there was no reception with T-Mobile. I couldn't call anyone for help. At that moment, I felt truly stuck. I went back into the truck, turned it on again, and let it idle to stay warm. Luckily, the engine didn't overheat while idling. I tried driving one more time, but the same thing happened again, so I had no choice but to wait. About 10 minutes later, I saw a car approaching. I turned on my hazard lights, opened the door, and waved my arms. The car stopped. It was a small Toyota. The driver rolled down his window, and I thanked him for stopping and asked if I could use his phone. He asked what happened, and I told him my truck was overheating and undrivable. Then he asked me if I was alone. I hesitated for a second before replying, yes. He reached for his phone and handed it to me. He must have been a local, as he had cell service. I called John, and when he picked up, I explained the situation. He told me to call a nearby towing company and said he would come pick me up. I gave him my exact location, and he said he would head over. After that, I called the towing company John mentioned and requested assistance. During both calls, the man in the car watched me the whole time, but I tried not to look back at him. Once I was done with the calls, I handed him back his phone and thanked him. He just said, "You're welcome," and without another word, he rolled up his window and drove off into the darkness, down the snowy road ahead. I watched as his taillights disappeared over the hill. Once again, I was alone. I got back into my truck to stay warm. I turned off the headlights for a moment, just to see how dark it was outside. When I say I couldn't see an inch beyond the windows, I'm not exaggerating. It was pure blackness. I sat there, waiting. With no internet connection, I had nothing to do but play games on my phone for about 20 minutes until I suddenly heard a loud bang on the passenger side window. I jumped out of my skin. Looking over at the window, I couldn't see much of the person. It was too dark outside, and the headlights didn't illuminate the sides of the truck. I heard a man's voice begging for help, shouting at me to open the door because he was freezing. I heard him trying to open the door, but it was locked. I shined my flashlight on the window, but it barely helped. All I could make out was someone in a big black coat with a hood pulled over their head. I shouted back, "What's wrong?" And the mysterious man outside replied, saying he was lost and stranded and needed to get out of the cold. I didn't trust him. I sat there, feeling nervous, trying to think of something to ask him to make sure he wasn't trying to harm me. But before I could say anything, he started aggressively trying to open the locked door, pounding on the glass even harder, still screaming for help. In that moment, I decided to trust my instincts. I put the truck into drive, and when he realized this, he pounded even harder on the window, trying to break it. I pulled back onto the road, quickly accelerating to 30 miles per hour, even though I knew I was probably damaging the overheating engine. But then I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. As I crested the hill, I saw the reflection of taillights parked on the side of the road ahead. As I drove past the car, I realized it was the same Toyota from earlier, the one that man had been driving. I slowed down and rolled down my window to see if he was still inside, but I didn't see anyone. The car looked empty. I glanced behind the car and saw my taillights illuminating footprints in the snow, leading away from the vehicle. That meant the man who had been banging on my window was him. He had been trying to trick me into opening the door, and who knows what would have happened if I had. I kept driving the truck, fully aware that I was ruining the engine. But at that point, I didn't care. A few minutes later, I saw headlights approaching from the other direction, and I felt a wave of relief when I realized it was the tow truck. I flashed my lights, and he pulled over. As the driver got out, I told him everything that had just happened. He joked that he arrived just in time. Then he asked if the guy had a gun or anything on him, but I told him I couldn't see. He replied, "Well, let's get this done quickly." It took him about 15 minutes to hook up my truck, and during that time, the Toyota never passed us. I figured the man had turned around and gone the other way. I borrowed the tow truck driver's phone to call John again and told him to meet us at the repair shop. To sum up the rest, John and I still went snowboarding that weekend, and the repair shop replaced the broken water pump in my truck, which was causing the overheating. A few weeks later, I sold the truck. I'm so glad I didn't roll down my window or unlock the door for that man. In that situation, I could have been killed, and no one would have ever known who did it. I had my first girlfriend when I was 17. At the time, I was living with my mom because my parents got divorced when I was 11. One day, I asked my girlfriend out on a date, and she immediately agreed. We both had part-time jobs. I worked at a small grocery store in town, and she worked at Starbucks. We both worked during the day and were in our senior year of high school. The reason I asked her out that day was because it was Friday, and we barely had any homework. After work, I picked her up from her house, and we went to a small restaurant about 10 minutes away from my place, as that was all I could afford at the time. After we ate, we went back to her house to hang out a bit more. By then, it had already gotten dark. She complained that our date was too short, and I explained that I couldn't afford to take her anywhere else that required money. We eventually agreed to go for a night drive. We drove around town, then ventured down a quiet road in the woods. Eventually, the paved road ended, and we were driving on a dirt road. I suddenly needed to use the restroom, and when I mentioned it to her, she said she needed to as well. We pulled over and got out of the car. Strangely, as soon as we stepped out, we were hit with a horrible, indescribable smell. I thought maybe someone else had pulled over here before us to do the same thing. My girlfriend almost gagged from the stench. I told her we would handle things quickly and get back to the car to return to town. There was a small flat area perfect for us to use. After we finished, we headed back to the car. But as we were walking back, we heard a noise to our left. It sounded like a branch snapping. I thought it might be an animal, so we hurried back to the car. Just as I was about to open the door, I heard a scream filled with fear or pain coming from the direction where we had just relieved ourselves. I told my girlfriend to get in the car while I went to check it out. She begged me not to go, but I decided to, so she would feel safer. I locked the doors and walked toward the area where we had been. I heard the scream again, and this time it was much closer. That sound drained all my courage. The scream seemed to come from the exact spot where we had heard the branch snap earlier. Instead of walking further, I pulled out my phone, turned on the flash, and snapped a picture. When the flash went off, I saw a man wearing a white shirt with black stripes, standing in front of a blue tarp. He was just standing there. Without hesitation, I bolted back to the car, unlocked the doors, got in, and sped away. My girlfriend kept asking what had happened, seeing the fear in my eyes. I told her I'd explain later. We drove back to a sketchier part of town, then headed back to her house. When we got to her room, I finally told her what I saw. The man standing in front of the blue tarp. I showed her the picture, and she was just as freaked out as I was. She let me stay over that night because we were both too scared, and since it was Friday, neither of us had work or school the next day. That was by far the scariest moment of my life. We aren't together anymore. I'm 23 now, and she's 22, but we're still best friends. It was late summer of 2011. I was almost 19, hanging out with my best friend, who was a few years younger than me. We lived in a rural area in southwestern Virginia, about 15 minutes from Mount Airy, North Carolina. Around here, almost everything shuts down by 10 p.m., so you have to find your own ways to pass the time. But that was never an issue for us, as we could always find something fun to do. That night started out pretty normally. First, we went to the mall, then cruised around looking for girls. The usual things teenage guys do. When that didn't pan out, we decided to go bowling until the alley closed. Afterward, we headed over to Main Street just before midnight, walking through some back alleys, acting like the rebellious badasses we thought we were. We never really felt in any danger because there wasn't much violent crime in our area. Once we had walked all the streets, we started to get bored and decided to grab a bite at Waffle House since it was the only place open late. After eating and making a quick stop at Walmart, we still weren't ready to go home, so we set out to drive around the country roads. This wasn't anything new for us. Like I said, out here you have to make your own fun, and nighttime drives were something we did all the time. The road we were on that night was one I'd only driven once before, and that was during the day. Though it wasn't far from either of our homes, we just never had a reason to drive down it. When we were still in North Carolina, the road was paved, but within a mile of crossing into Virginia, it turned into a dirt road. Like many dirt roads around here, the county didn't give it much attention since it was so far out of the way and only had a few houses along it. The road would often wash out during heavy rains, so we had to drive much slower. Being unfamiliar with the road, we were practically crawling along. Even though we were more cautious now, the road seemed like any other we'd driven. At this time of night, roads around here are basically empty, and with only a few houses along this stretch, we were certain we wouldn't run into any other cars. The road was mostly wooded and sat at the base of a small mountain. At night, it's easy to miss any houses along it. We probably would have driven by without noticing them if we hadn't caught a glimpse of a light out of the corner of our eyes. We both looked over and saw a man standing under his porch light. We couldn't make out any details of his face, but it was clear that he was watching us, standing completely still, except for his head turning to follow us. Although we were both getting a little uneasy, we tried not to overthink it. We figured he was just stepping outside for a cigarette, but his presence made us feel uncomfortable. Even though nothing happened with the man, it was only the beginning. We started to pick up speed as the conversation about him made us more nervous. A few minutes later, we reached the end of the road and were back on a paved road I knew well, one I drove about once a week. We turned right and immediately felt better, knowing we could now leave the thoughts of that man behind us. The road we were on now followed a ridge, offering a beautiful view of the town below. After a few miles, we reached the end of that road and made another right to head back toward my house. This road was more wooded than the last, but I was even more familiar with it, having driven it thousands of times before. As we were nearing the main highway, we saw something ahead in the distance, just within the reach of my headlights. There are lots of deer around here, so we figured that's all it was and slowed down. But as we got closer, we noticed it was much whiter than a deer's brown coat. Still, we were used to seeing the occasional albino deer, so we thought that's what it must be. But as we got even closer, we realized it wasn't an animal at all. It was definitely a person, hunched over, with their back turned to us. They were walking in the left lane, facing oncoming traffic, as they were supposed to. I looked over at my friend, and he asked, "What the hell is someone doing walking out here at this hour?" I looked back at the person and finally made out that it was an older woman with long, scraggly gray hair, wearing a white t-shirt and white pants. She didn't turn around until we were only about 50 feet away. That's when she finally turned to face us, and we got our first look at her face. I don't want to say she was on drugs, but that's the vibe she gave off. Deep-set eyes with heavy dark bags under them, greasy hair, and very weathered skin. I couldn't tell how old she was, but if I had to guess, I'd say mid-40s to late 50s. But that wasn't the worst part. She raised her arms in the air and started frantically waving them, running toward us. When she did, we could see what looked like dried blood all over the front of her shirt and pants, and what appeared to be a large knife in one of her hands. We didn't know what she wanted, but our desire to act like rebellious badasses disappeared instantly. We floored it and didn't stop until we hit the highway. We were so shaken by the whole ordeal that what would have been a quick 5-minute drive to my house turned into a 35-minute detour, just out of the irrational fear that she might somehow follow us. In small communities like ours, you know almost everyone, but neither of us had ever seen this woman before, nor have we seen her since. We kept an eye on local news for any reports of a bloody woman being picked up, but we never heard a thing. I can't even begin to explain why she would have been walking along a backcountry road at nearly 4 a.m. in that condition, covered in blood, holding a knife, with all the risks of encountering both humans and wild animals. Fast forward to today. I now live with my wife on that quiet ridge road between the two roads where the incident happened. I drive the latter road nearly every day and still haven't seen any trace of that strange woman. However, just earlier this year, a major drug and dogfighting ring was busted down the road from where we saw the man watching us. I don't know if it was the same house or if those people were even around back then, but after everything that's happened, I often wonder if it was the same place and if that man had been keeping watch. As for the woman, I just hope I never run into her again. I take the same route every day, in and out of the city. My house isn't too far away, just about a 30-minute drive to the peaceful suburbs. The road I take is always quiet at night, which is a huge relief compared to the traffic during the day. That night, I was driving the usual way, and everything was going as normal. It was just after 10 p.m. I was listening to music, feeling happy that I was only 10 minutes away from home, as I entered the wooded area just before the suburbs. Suddenly, a bright light appeared in the distance. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as it got closer, the light became blinding, almost making it hard to see. I had to focus on the side of the road to make sure I didn't veer out of my lane. But just when I thought the car would pass me, I realized their tires were right in my lane. They were driving on the wrong side of the road, and we were about to have a head-on collision. Instinctively, I jerked the steering wheel to the right, flying off the road and crashing into a deep ditch next to the forest. It took me a few seconds to gather my senses, but luckily, I wasn't seriously hurt. I unbuckled my seatbelt and jumped out of the car. My car was wrecked. The entire front was basically torn off, and I couldn't believe I had survived. Then I remembered what had happened and got really angry. I climbed out of the ditch and looked down the road. I expected to see the other car's headlights disappearing in the distance, but to my surprise, they had stopped and pulled over not too far away. Before approaching them, I quickly looked around and realized how secluded the area was. So, instead of confronting them right away, I ran back to my car, grabbed my phone, and called the police. I didn't know who was in that car, whether they were drunk or dangerous, So I decided to play it safe. The dispatcher said the police would arrive in about 5 minutes, so I hung up and started climbing back up the ditch, but I was startled to see a man already standing there. He didn't ask if I was okay or say anything at all. "Were you the one who caused me to crash? You nearly killed me," I said, trying to hold back my anger until the cops arrived. He still didn't say anything, but suddenly, the lights from their car got even brighter and started moving closer to where he was standing. I was still down in the ditch, but I could see it was the same car, and someone else was driving it. The car backed up to the edge of the ditch, and the driver's door swung open. Another man got out. The two men started speaking to each other in a language I couldn't understand, maybe Russian or German. I'm not great with languages, but their voices sounded harsh and aggressive. As they spoke, one of the men rushed to the back of the car and popped open the trunk. But instead of grabbing something, he turned to face me. Both of them then immediately started running down the ditch toward me. It didn't take me more than a second to figure out what was happening. I turned around and sprinted into the woods as they ran around my car, still chasing me. Both of them were big, heavy-set men, so after a solid minute of sprinting, I had lost them. Now, I was deep in the woods, with no light to guide me, and no idea which way to go. I didn't even know which direction I was heading. When I couldn't hear them anymore, I started wandering through the trees. I didn't want to go back to the road while they were still around, but I also didn't want to get too lost for the police to find me. After a few minutes of walking, I heard police sirens in the distance to my left. I followed the sound, and it led me back to the road, where I saw the police car parked at the top of the ditch, with 2 officers inspecting my wrecked car. There was no sign of the 2 men. I explained everything to the officers, and they took down a report, but the follow-up investigation didn't go far, since we only had a vague description of the 2 men. Nothing was stolen from my car, but it was clear they had been trying to throw me into their trunk. Whether that was their plan all along or something they decided after the crash, I'll never know. Maybe they made a mistake and were trying to cover it up, or perhaps it had all been planned from the start.